I'd been doing some reading over the last week or so just on some of the themes in the healthcare and life sciences space, and one of them is the big patent cliff that's coming up. And I think I was reviewing some of the materials out there, and I believe it was Morgan Stanley that estimated about $130 billion worth of patented products were going to go off patent between now and 2030. So that's pretty big. And I think some other companies have been maybe cutting back on their workforces. I think we saw Bristol Myers was one example. They
Mhm.
they were cutting back on some of their spending related to that. So it's a big deal. And I put out a list of some of the big names that are that some of the big drug products that are going to roll off patent. We don't really need to touch on that, but I thought I'd just ask both of you kind of what do you think about this big patent cliff, maybe and how it differs from the past one, which was I think in 2016. There were a
Mhm.
number of products that were rolling off because things are a little bit different this time. I think maybe small molecule versus dominating the drugs to maybe a few more biologics now, which kind of changes
Right.
things. I wanted to hear your thoughts on how things might be different this time, and then also how this will resolve itself. How will we get through the patent cliff?
Hey, Brian, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, so I think, John, firstly, like you were mentioning with the difference between the small molecule and biologics, I think that really kind of plays into, what we're seeing in terms of the difficulty of supply and manufacturing for a lot of these drugs on market today. It's not quite as simple as something just losing exclusivity and, the sales declining 50% in year one. You're really going to have a build out of manufacturing capacity from the generics that are going to compete. And so with the more complex molecules, that's going to take more time. And so, potentially slower, patent erosion cliff than we've seen in the past. I would also say that, kind of on that front, you're also having the impact of the IRA and the drug price negotiations as well. And so, even with this patent cliff upcoming, you'd already have a significant threat to upcoming revenues from those drug pricing negotiations. So, it's almost kind of would be happening regardless with the IRA, or with the IRA, it'd be happening with the patent cliff regardless. So I think that those kind of offset the significance of each one individually. And as a result of that, you're going to have less impact from either your drug patent negotiation because you have the patent cliff, and once there's a generic available, then the drug's no longer eligible for negotiations, or vice versa, in terms
Mhm.
of the negotiations happening and that kind of preventing the erosion.
Okay, John, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, so I think, the all of the branded manufacturers, myself included, our company included, has become much smarter in managing the generic erosion. And so when you look at a biologic product, the entries into the market are much slower. And so, to the point that Brian made, manufacturing is more complex in a biologic. The proving bioequivalency is more difficult. There typically is some trade secrets around the manufacturing of products, and that's what makes it more difficult. And so that's, kind of on the biologic side. And then what you're also seeing is some of the large branded manufacturers are bringing in BLA abilities themselves, so they can actually manufacture their own generic drug.
Mm.
And so they kind of say, okay, well, I'm going to lose share at my branded price, but I'll go ahead and try to maintain share at my generic price. And it's, a process called authorized generics. And so that's been something that's really changed from 2016 to now. I
Yeah.
think, yeah, it is, so that's a huge difference. And then on the oral solids play, if you have a traditional loss of exclusivity, you're going to end up with eight competitors and within a 2-year period of time. And as a branded manufacturer, you kind of end up with 8% share because people like your drug. They still want to buy the branded drug. And you just kind of forecast that into your product life cycle management. What you'll see, a company like, take Novo Nordisk and what they did with Wegovy and Saxenda. So they really kind of planned the deprecation of Saxenda from a patent perspective and brought Wegovy in to replace that. And so that's another strategy that people have gotten smarter about. It's a little bit more difficult because of the way that rebates are calculated in Medicaid. So you can't just have a new NDC and a new product. It's the esoteric mechanics of how to manage rebates in the United States. But so there's a wider variety of strategies that are available to pharma to manage through those patent cliffs, and more complex manufacturing is actually serving as a benefit to those branded manufacturers.
Yeah. And then, even though it's going to be a little bit harder to, for upstarts to come in with biosimilars, there's still going to be a patent cliff, and
yeah, for sure,
the companies are still going to have to somehow address that. And, M&A is generally the way I think they'd probably do it. It seems like, in my opinion, that there's a lot more emphasis on relying on outside developers to come up with new molecules versus doing it internally. We'd love to hear your thoughts on that solution for the patent cliff.
So the way that we look at it is, when you're developing a pharmaceutical, if you see the inflection point for somebody who starts out with a venture-backed drug, right? And so venture-backed drug, they've licensed it from a university and they're going to run it through its process. The biggest inflection point in value for a venture-backed drug is at the end of phase 2. And so what you'll see is that's your best return on invested capital as a venture fund, if you're not taking the company public and you're really looking to divest the asset. What large pharma likes to do is they like to take that asset that's been qualified at the end of phase 2 and run it through a phase 3 trial or a multiple phase 3 trial, particularly if it has, a current leading indication, plus it has other indications that the drug can be used for in the future. And that is kind of the great, value inflection point. And that's when you see, very, very large numbers, multi-billion-dollar numbers being written in terms of check size to buy those types of assets. And so that's always been, as somebody who's done a lot of drug development, a lot of venture-backed drug development, that is certainly, kind of the sweet spot. And that is, ideally how large pharma deals with, their patent and really their scientific portfolio. They're great at that end of stage development process, but they're not very good at the discovery process and getting the drug all the way through.
Well, John, I've mentioned that I've noticed in recent years that a lot of the acquisitions are taking place later and later. There were a few that took place. I'm thinking of the schizophrenia space. There were a couple acquisitions, or CNS space, perhaps to be a little bit more broad, where the acquisition was made after it was submitted to the FDA, but before it was approved. There are a couple of cases of that. Pretty much all the money's been spent except for the commercialization expense. And I think that goes hand in hand with a lot of the companies wanting to reduce risk. Any thoughts from you guys on that and the shift away? Because, when I grew up in the industry, it was the proof of concept, end of phase 2 was where you handed it off for the kind of the more the regulatory focused efforts and the expense of the phase 3. So, but it seems like we've kind of shifted away from that. But are we going to go back to the old way of doing it, or what are your guys' thoughts on that?
So I'll jump in here. I think it's on a case-by-case basis. So it really depends on the indication. So if you look at an orphan indication, and and it's what is called a 503B, indication, that's a drug that's already in man. That's pretty well scientifically de-risked. And so a pharma company is going to feel more comfortable about stepping into that process to take on the pivotal trial expense. And they'll get a discount to that. When you look at something that, is a complex manufacturing process and is, really has gone through the phase 3, there's so much private capital and so much royalty-based capital that's available for doing large complex phase 3 funding. It's less about risk transference and it's more about capital availability for some of these larger, more established drug developers, guys who have a pretty good track record behind them. So it's really a case-by-case basis, John. That's the way that I've seen it.
Okay. Any further thoughts on that, Bryan? Like with the will we solve it through M&A, or will big companies make more internal investments, or do you think they may just buy earlier, perhaps, to fill up the pipeline?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be kind of a combination of both of them, and it really depends on the company and how well they've done at consistently progressing their pipeline. We've definitely seen, some of the large pharma companies, especially with the patent cliffs that have happened over the past few years, really struggling in terms of having anything late stage in their pipeline and being forced to resort to M&A, or drop offs like we're seeing in terms of Pfizer and their COVID drop off, or the upcoming Merck loss of exclusivity with Keytruda is going to be a very large one.
Yeah.
And so all of those are going to be really important in order to replace. And I think, as it comes to our assessment, one of the things we're really looking at is this a prudent use of capital by the companies, both in terms of their availability of capital and then in terms of what their current pipeline looks like, at what points of the pipeline do they need to really build out, some breadth or depth, and then also, is it in areas of their expertise? And so, one of the examples I would give that kind of worked out, or not necessarily an acquisition, but also, one of our companies, AstraZeneca, has kind of taken the approach more so of the collaboration. And so you've seen them collaborate with Daiichi in terms of their ADCs, and you've also seen them collaborate with Amgen and with Tezspire for asthma. And both of those have been very successful, but they're still able to somewhat mitigate that risk through collaboration, which I think kind of is a best of both worlds approach in a space where you're not necessarily the leading company. But we've also seen, with Novo Nordisk, with their acquisition, I think last year, of a cannabinoid type 2 receptor, which was in phase 1 development. And that was one of the early weight loss drugs back in the 2000s that was approved in the EU, but never in the US. It ultimately had a lot of side effects in terms of, suicide risk and mental illness. But the company that Novo acquired is potentially looking to kind of tweak that through the blood-brain barrier and things of that nature. And so that would be an example where the M&A makes sense, given Novo's expertise in obesity, their position as the number one company there, or number two, and their extreme excess of cash flow really made sense for that M&A.